Hello, and thank you for joining us. So we are going to be talking through Microsoft 365 compliance and giving an overview of Microsoft 365 compliance capabilities. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending a copy of the recording and of the slides to everyone that registered after the event. Also, throughout this session, what's nice is we have time for Q&A at the end of it. So we have Q&A in the top right-hand corner. Please do pop your questions in, and we will have time for them at the end of the session. We're looking at about 40 to 45 minutes running through the webinar, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So I'm going to pass you over to Jason now. Over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Jason Lee. I'm the Collaboration and Content Lead at Chorus. We are a Microsoft Gold partner in the UK. So today we're going to take a look at the importance of data governance and protection. We'll have a look at an overview of the Microsoft 365 E5 compliance capabilities. We'll look at a typical high-level implementation roadmap, and we'll cover some best practices as well. So we're not going to get into the deep technical details today. This is more about the bird's eye view of what's available and what kind of problems each platform solves. So just before we get into the detail, a bit of breaking news. Since we named the event, almost everything compliance and data governance related is now Microsoft Purview. So this brings together what was Microsoft 365 compliance and what was Azure Purview. And the vision for this, the idea is that as a set of technologies, Microsoft Purview gives you a complete solution for protecting and managing your entire data estate. So let's quickly look at the importance of data governance and protection. So we're looking at increasing regulations. So across the world, there are more and more data protection regulations that you need to be aware of and adhere to. If you're over here in the UK or Europe with us, GDPR is obviously the big one. And you can see that the stat there, 83% of companies are experiencing challenges in ensuring that they stay compliant with their data management. We've got an ever-increasing amount of unstructured data. The amount of unstructured data, so files and emails that we're storing, is growing exponentially. And we're storing those files and emails in increasingly diverse locations as well. So on-premise, remote, private cloud, public cloud, and so on. And the risks are really about reputation and financial loss here. If you suffer a data breach, there's obviously a loss of trust. Your customers are going to lose confidence. There's reputational damage sometimes in the long term, and the risk of monetary fines as well. So let's jump into the compliance capabilities. So Microsoft Purview as a platform is huge. It's a vast set of technologies. So given our limited time today, we're going to focus on those Microsoft 365 based capabilities, and in particular, some of the key functional areas. So we're going to look at these 8 areas of Microsoft Purview today. And we'll start with information protection. So Microsoft Purview Information Protection. This was previously called Microsoft Information Protection, or MIP. Before that, it was Azure Information Protection, or AIP. This is all about classifying and protecting information by labeling it. And this is aimed at these kind of problems. So how do you ensure that all your data, whether it's structured or unstructured, is classified consistently based on its sensitivity? So how are you implementing and enforcing your data classification policy? How can you manage what the recipient of a sensitive file or email can do with it? Can they forward it? Can they print it? Can they copy text out of it? And how can you simplify guest access management on your containers in Microsoft 365? So classify your SharePoint sites, your Microsoft Teams, your Microsoft 365 groups, and use that classification to manage your guest access. So how does it work? We create sensitivity labels to reflect our sensitivity levels, our classifications. If we apply them to files and emails, we can apply headers and footers, we can apply watermarks, we can encrypt those files and emails and basically use that to apply rights management and control who can access those files and emails and what they can do with the contents. If we apply our labels to sites and teams, we can manage the privacy options. So you can see that over here on the right hand side. You can force teams to be private or public. We can control whether the site and team owners can add external users. We can manage access from unmanaged devices. So if we've got a sensitive team, we can say you can only access it on a Azure AD joined managed device. And we can apply conditional access policies. So we use authentication context to tie specific conditional access policies in Azure AD to specific classification levels. So next, we've got data lifecycle management and records management, and we're covering these two together because they are essentially the same underlying set of technologies. So data lifecycle management, this was previously called information governance in Microsoft 365. We've got the two solutions that overlap substantially. So records management is available with E5 licenses only, whereas you get some elements of data lifecycle management with E3 licenses. And the scope of all of this is information within Microsoft 365. So it's information in SharePoint, in Teams, in OneDrive for Business, and your emails in Exchange. It's all about managing how long information is kept, and we do that by labeling it either manually or automatically. And this solves a few different problems. One is, how can you protect information from deletion while you're obliged to keep it? Another might be how you preserve information to meet specific record keeping requirements. Conversely, it could be about how you ensure information is deleted when you're obliged to remove it. And building on that is, how can you prove information has been deleted? So in some industries, you are required to retain proof of deletion for certain types of sensitive information. And this works across both of these solutions, so across data lifecycle management and across records management. It works by creating retention labels. So we create retention labels to reflect all the different types of content in your organization. So these are business content types. It could be things like invoices, complaints, risk assessments, cost assessments, CVs, resumes, and so on. Every label we create, we associate controls with the label, and that could be to retain information, to delete it after a specified length of time, or to preserve it as a record. We can apply these labels in various ways. We can apply them manually, so users can manually tag files with a retention policy, with a retention label. We can apply these labels automatically based on location. So if you drop a file into a specific SharePoint library or drag an email into a specific subfolder in your Outlook, you can have a retention label applied automatically. Or we can get more sophisticated and apply these labels automatically using sensitive information types, which are basically pattern matching tools or trainable classifiers, where we basically train a machine learning algorithm to trawl your content and apply these retention labels automatically. Just very briefly, a few advanced capabilities here. We've got disposition review, event-driven retention, and file plans. So disposition review is about what happens when you reach the end of your retention period. So with basic retention labels, you're basically either lifting the protection or you're deleting it. Disposition review builds on that. It means that when you reach the end of a retention period, you trigger a review process. So a reviewer has a queue of these files that have reached the end of their retention period. That reviewer can then either permanently delete the file, extend the retention period, or change the label if they want to. Event-driven retention means that you trigger a retention period in response to an event. So the classic example here is HR information. So when an employee leaves your organization, you trigger a retention policy with event-driven retention. That basically means all records relating to that employee are deleting in 3 years' time. There's a bit of setup that goes into that. Basically, when you create and apply the labels, you're also applying an asset ID, like an employee number, so that wherever those records are located, Lifecycle management can locate them and effectively time bomb them. So finally, file plans are a more sophisticated way of managing labels and classification. So file plans are really useful if you work in a sort of more highly regulated environment. The way this works, you can export all of your retention labels into a spreadsheet. So you work through reviews and revisions with your stakeholders, you run workshops, you build up basically all of your retention requirements in a spreadsheet. Then you import it back into Microsoft 365, create those labels and those policies automatically from that spreadsheet. Okay, so moving on to data loss prevention, or DLP. So DLP is all about detecting and in some cases preventing sensitive information from being shared in inappropriate ways. And usually that's about stopping sensitive information from leaving the organization. It doesn't have to be, it could be also stopping information being shared with the wrong people within an organization. And this all works through pattern matching, through sensitive information types. So sensitive information types are basically patterns for things like credit card data, personal data addresses, tax numbers, national insurance numbers, passport numbers, or any custom patterns that you use in your organization. So if you've got bespoke format for your employee numbers or specific words and phrases you use in sensitive projects, you can create your own sensitive information types to drive your DLP policies. So the problems we're looking to solve here, this is all about how you prevent sensitive information from leaving your organization, or how you detect when that information has been handled inappropriately. And it's about how you prevent data leaks, whether accidental or malicious. So briefly, there are 3 elements to DLP policies. You've got scope, conditions, and actions. Scope is about where you want the DLP policies to look. So you can see here, you can apply these policies to content both inside and outside Microsoft 365. So you can cover all the Microsoft 365 repositories, Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. Also Windows 10 or 11 devices, Mac OS devices through endpoint DLP. You can apply DLP policies to on-premises file shares, legacy SharePoint server sites with the DLP on-premises scanner. And you can also apply policies to various third-party cloud platforms through Defender for Cloud Apps. Conditions is all about what should trigger the policy. So typically this is, you've got a policy that will be looking for specific sensitive information types in combination with various other things, such as the information that's being shared externally. You can apply very granular conditions to DLP. So you can see some of these for email properties on the right hand side, and you can combine these conditions in any way you want. So you can really get very targeted, very focused with your DLP conditions. Finally, the actions are about what you want to do when your policy is triggered. And this can be anything from simply logging the incident or notifying an administrator, right up to applying protection or blocking the sharing action altogether. If we look at endpoint DLP, you've got a range of different capabilities here as well. So if I'm working on my Windows 11 laptop and we've got endpoint DLP set up, Endpoint DLP can stop me uploading sensitive information to cloud services like Google Drive. It can stop me copying to the clipboard, stop me copying to a removable drive, and so on. So you've got a really powerful set of capabilities there. Okay, next on the list is information barriers. So information barriers is all about preventing messaging or file sharing between specific areas of an organization. So this is typically important in some financial industries where there are regulatory obligations to stop communication between certain areas of a business. So this is all about how you restrict communication and collaboration between users in different geographies or between various teams who might have conflicts of interest. It works by basically dividing up your workforce. We do that by defining segments based on exchange attributes. And then for each segment that we define, so we might define segments based on geographies. It might be based on departments or teams. We then create policies, and these policies either allow or prohibit communication between two segments. So this is primarily aimed at Teams communication, so direct messaging in Teams. You can also opt SharePoint and OneDrive into this. So if a SharePoint site is owned by a user in one segment, you can prevent users in conflicting segments from joining that SharePoint site. Information barriers is a fairly blunt tool. So you either allow communication between two sets of users or you block it altogether. There's no nuance. It's really aimed at those regulatory scenarios where you're obliged to take steps to restrict communication between specific sets of users. If you need more nuance, if, for example, you want to monitor communications between two sets of users, but only when they're sharing specific sensitive types of information, then you need communication compliance instead, which gives you far more capabilities. We'll look at that in just a second. It's also worth pointing out this doesn't apply to email. So this doesn't stop users in different segments emailing each other. If you want to do that, you need to look at Mailflow rules instead. Okay, so moving on to communication compliance. So communication compliance is all about detecting and preventing various different types of inappropriate electronic communications. So it allows you to monitor internal communications over email, over Teams chat, also over Yammer. You can also use connectors to import comms from third-party platforms. So if you're using things like Slack or WhatsApp, you can ingest those communications and apply policies to those as well. So the kinds of problems communication compliance can solve, this is things like how you prevent bullying or harassment over email or over Teams messaging. It's about how you monitor how your sensitive information is being shared within your organization. It's a way of monitoring potential conflicts of interest. And it can also be about meeting specific regulatory requirements as well for monitoring of communications. So in some industries, you'll be obliged to monitor a subset of all communications between particular teams. So this works by basically setting up policies that match trainable classifiers. So Microsoft provides about 49 built-in trainable classifiers. These use machine learning to detect things like swearing, threats, targeted harassment, as well as some function-specific content, so things like legal content, HR or financial content, and so on. It's very easy to set up using these built-in trainable classifiers, but you can get very specific, very targeted as well. So it's highly customizable. It's far more powerful than things like information barriers, and you can really tailor this to work in exactly the way you want it to. It can also, and this is quite recent, include OCR, so optical character recognition. So if people are sharing memes, graphics, screenshots, it can monitor for inappropriate or sensitive content in those forms of communication as well. It works by generating alerts, and when you get these alerts, you can either work through them, review, resolve them interactively. You can also automate them, so you can trigger a Power Automate flow and process these things automatically. So, for example, alerting a line manager. You can also integrate with the SIM. So if you use things like Azure Sentinel, you can feed through your compliance alerts to Sentinel and have them picked up there. Okay, so moving on. Next on the list is insider risk management. So insider risk management is a platform that really draws on a whole bunch of different Microsoft security and compliance tools, and it brings them all together to give you something really quite powerful. And this is all about detecting misuse of data within an organization. So it's looking at a few specific problems, things like how do we prevent IP theft? How do we detect when sensitive data is being leaked? How do we detect when people are violating regulatory or compliance rules? And insider risk management works through policy indicators. So policy indicators are basically drawing signals or data from a whole bunch of different sources. So this can include things like users deleting files on SharePoint, downloading files on SharePoint, adding external users, sharing sensitive content, so on. It can also be a whole range of different things. So if you've onboarded devices for compliance, you can collect indicators for things like copying files to USB or printing files or moving files to network shares. If you've deployed Defender for Endpoint and you've enabled alert sharing, you can collect indicators for things like users installing malicious software. If you've set up Defender for Cloud apps, you can collect indication for unusual activity on third-party cloud file sharing platforms, so things like Box.com and Dropbox. And you can also use these data connectors to pull in data from a whole range of different line of business apps. So a common example is the HR connector. So you can connect up your HR system to insider risk management and use signals from this HR system in combination with signals from Microsoft 365. So if, for example, you combine a user's just handed in their resignation and suddenly they're downloading an unusually high number of files from SharePoint, those two signals combined give you a pretty good indication that you've got a potential case of intellectual property theft. You can also integrate physical access management, so indicators like accessing a server room. So it's a really powerful way of aggregating signals, information from lots of different places. So the final platform on our list today is eDiscovery. So eDiscovery is really aimed at legal cases or investigations. It's about how you locate and collect all the electronic information that might relate to a specific investigation, a specific case. How do you collect it all up, hold it, and make it easy to process? So it's typically used for things like fulfilling data subject requests or locating every piece of correspondence and emails and documents relating to a specific project or a contract under dispute, or locating and gathering up all the correspondence between a specific member of a team and a specific supplier. And it works in really 3 different ways. So we've got standard eDiscovery, premium eDiscovery, and user data search. So standard eDiscovery is what you get at the E3 license level. And this gives you the ability to create cases and search for content across all your Microsoft 365 data stores. So you can search across Exchange, OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams, Yammer. You can create holds to preserve the content, so anything under investigation gets preserved and can't be deleted. You can also export the content. So premium eDiscovery comes with the E5 license level, and this is really aimed at organisations who need this kind of functionality on a regular basis. It's more sophisticated, it's more formal, and it's aimed at those larger investigations where typically you're going to have multiple people involved in processing all this data. So premium eDiscovery takes you through a very structured workflow where you start by identifying people of interest, data stores of interest. You preserve those data sources, you send out legal hold notices if you need to. You collect, extract the relevant data from those data sources. You work through a review process where you refine your queries. What you're trying to do really is to reduce that data volume. You can tag and annotate documents. You can run some sophisticated analysis on those documents to detect things like near duplicates, threaded emails, contextual themes within documents. And then finally, you're going to produce and present that final set of documents for legal review. So in practice, what effective eDiscovery is really about is reducing the number of documents for review as much as possible. You're going to start with a huge set of information, and you're really trying to cull as much of that as possible, funnel it, make it as focused as possible so that your legal team is going to be spending time on only the most relevant documents. So premium eDiscovery includes some great tools for doing that. So theme detection is one example. This is about automatically extracting key semantic themes from documents to help you judge whether it's relevant or not. So near duplication detection is another one. So this identifies broadly similar documents. So if you've got lots of documents that are built on the same template, contain lots of boilerplate text, premium eDiscovery can identify that and highlight the differences for you, just basically so you're spending the least amount of time as possible trawling through text. There's also something called predictive coding in Purview, which lets you train a machine learning algorithm to analyze content for relevance. So basically you train up your predictive coding algorithm, you let it loose on the content, it runs through all the content, and it assigns a prediction score to each one that basically predicts how relevant it thinks that content will be. Then you adjust the threshold, process only what you want, and again, it's hopefully you're reducing the amount of information that your team has to trawl through. Just a quick note on Priva. So Microsoft Priva is a fairly new privacy management platform. So this isn't actually part of Microsoft Purview, and it's not included in Microsoft 365, even at the E5 level. It's an add-on for any organizations with enterprise licenses. So if you've got E3 or E5, you can buy it. There are 2 parts to it: privacy risk management and subject rights requests. And you can buy the 2 parts either separately or together. So we'll cover these super quickly as time is limited. So firstly, privacy risk management. This is really looking at 3 areas. Microsoft calls them data overexposure, data transfers, and data minimization. So data overexposure policies look for personal data that's shared in what might be inappropriate ways. So for example, if you've got a file and it contains some personal data, names, addresses, sensitive details, If you're sharing it through anonymous links or everyone in the organization links, or with guest or external users in SharePoint or OneDrive, there's a good chance that's inappropriate for sensitive data, and data overexposure policies will flag that for you. Data transfer policies are looking for personal data that's shared with people outside your organization. So it doesn't matter whether it's Teams or OneDrive or SharePoint or over email, it will flag where sensitive data is being shared with people outside the organization. You can customize this to look at internal restrictions as well. So we talked about information barriers earlier. We talked about how it was a blunt tool. This gives you really a far more sophisticated way of doing that. You can say, I want to look at communication between these areas of the business, but only if it's financial data or personal data or any other specific types of information that you choose. So finally, data minimization. This is about looking for data that hasn't been modified in at least 30 days. So you've got sensitive data and it's potentially getting stale. You're potentially holding it for longer than you need to. So by default, it will start shouting at 30 days. You can customize that to work over long time periods if required. As you'd expect, you can do a whole range of different things when you get a policy match, right from notifying people to applying controls and making that data private. The off-the-shelf policies are a pretty good place to start with privacy risk management. It all builds on sensitive information types, which underpin DLP and various other things we covered. But you can really customize this to any extent you want to. Just lost my slides. Right, subject rights requests, just quickly. These are about responding to subject rights requests, data subject requests, data subject status requests, or whatever you call them, in a very slick and managed way. So it gives you an end-to-end workflow that guides you through the whole process of meeting a subject rights request, right from collating the data to identifying conflicts. So for example, if you've got information relating to your subject that also includes confidential information on someone else, applying redactions when necessary, and issuing a report. So it's basically streamlining that whole subject rights request process. So eDiscovery will do subject rights requests at a very basic level, but subject rights requests in Microsoft Priva really gives you a far slicker workflow for doing that. Okay, so we'll look at a typical implementation roadmap, and it's probably worth saying here that we approach a roadmap differently with compliance tools than we do with security. Whereas with security, you'll often aim to do pretty much everything, use every available control in a particular order. Compliance is much more about using Microsoft Purview as a toolbox. So don't necessarily aim to do absolutely everything. Use this as a toolbox, use tools to solve the specific problems that you're facing. So first, a few prerequisites. These aren't essential, but I think they are sensible. You're going to get far more out of these compliance tools if you consolidate your content first. So the big one really is get your mailboxes migrated. You have far more ability to manage and apply compliance policies to mailboxes if they are in Exchange Online. Ideally, also bring over any home drives. So if users are still using file share based home drives, bring them over to OneDrive for Business. Where possible, bring your file shares into SharePoint or Teams, and consolidate cloud file sharing as well. So if you're using a whole bunch of different cloud-based file sharing platforms, you're going to have an easier life if you consolidate and coalesce around Microsoft 365 tools if you can. It's also worth being clear on what's driving your compliance policies, so make sure you're information classification policy, your data handling policies are nailed down before you start. So in terms of how you sort of use these compliance tools as you grow in sophistication as an organisation, we probably start with those prerequisites. So get the prerequisites nailed first, get the mailbox migrations done, get the content migrations done, make sure your information policies are well defined. We've then got some tools that are fairly easy to get going with right away. So things like information barriers, information protection for classifying sites and teams, or using subject rights requests in Priva. There's really no interdependencies here. You can get going on these right away. Some of these other tools, still very little in the way of interdependencies, but they do require probably more in the way of planning, more ongoing management and maintenance. So we've got things like file and email classification, eDiscovery, DLP, privacy risk management, and data lifecycle management. At this point, before you go too much further, you might want to look at integrating with Sentinel or the SIM of your choice. You're also going to get more value out of things like communication compliance if you start leveraging third-party data connectors. So start ingesting information from any other systems you use, like Slack or WhatsApp, or industry-specific tools such as Bloomberg. Off the back of that, we can bring in communication compliance. If we onboard devices, we can start leveraging endpoint DLP and extend that protection to Windows 10 devices, Windows 11 devices, Mac OS devices. If we bring in Defender for Cloud apps, we can look at extending our protection policies to third-party cloud apps as well. But if we bring in Defender for Endpoint, which hopefully you do earlier on anyway, if you're looking at a security roadmap in parallel, you can then look at insider risk management that brings many of these different tools together and gives you that sort of overarching insight and control. So just to wrap up then, a few best practices based on our experience for implementation. So firstly, let the policy lead the technology. There can be a temptation, particularly where IT teams are really leading the business on these technologies. There's a temptation to build the policy around the technology. This really needs to be based on business requirements. It needs to start with well-defined policies. So make sure you've got a well-defined information classification policy or data protection policy, data handling policy, data retention policy, or whatever your organization, your industry needs. And those policies really need to drive what you're doing with these Microsoft Purview tools. Typically, you also want to be rolling out these tools in a progressive way. So avoid the temptation to jump in with both feet. Most of these tools, because they have the potential to disrupt business activity, you need to be pretty certain of exactly how they're going to behave before you roll them out across an entire organization. So start by testing them on pilot groups. Most of these tools, things like DLP, include test modes, report only modes, where you can kind of get a what if insight into how this policy is going to behave if you turn it on. So you can roll out a policy, have it running in report mode, see just how many people you're going to be blocking. You can look at what it's blocking, you can monitor it, you can tune it, you can make sure that you're pretty confident, you've got a high confidence in what it's doing before you actually start blocking your managing director from sending emails. And finally, the tuning and revising is an important point, particularly for things like DLP. The types of information you're sharing are going to change Regulations can also change on a continuous basis. So these are tools that you need to be monitoring. You need to be watching what it's doing, looking at trends, making sure that you're tuning it, revising it as necessary to keep it relevant. Okay, and at that point, I think we'll hand over to questions.
Thanks, Jason. That was brilliant. I've got a few here, but just before we go into questions, one that just cropped up was about the recording of the webinar. So I just want to clarify that a copy of the recording and the slides will be sent to everyone, but there will also be a version of it that is saved on our website and YouTube, so you can watch back at any time. So over to some more of the technical questions that we've got coming through. Just want to start off with, I've got a question about Microsoft Priva. How is Microsoft Priva licensed?
Okay, so Priva is an add-on. So regardless of whether you're E1, E3 or E5, you are going to have to pay for it. The two parts are essentially separate. So privacy risk management is a per user per month subscription. From memory, in the UK, it's about £3 or £4 a month per user. Although our team will be able to confirm that for you if you need to. Subject rights requests are done slightly differently. So these are basically charged per request. So you can buy these in batches of, I think, 1, 10 or 100. So literally you could buy them ad hoc just when you need them. From memory, I think, again, over here, it's roughly £10 per request. Microsoft do offer a decent trial, so you can get a 90-day free trial that covers both the risk management and the subject rights requests. So it's worth doing if you find you've got a subject rights request to deal with. You want to try out Microsoft Priva, that's probably a good time to sign up to that 90-day trial, and you can process, I believe it's unlimited rights requests within that 90 days.
Thanks, Jason. I've got another one. Can review by legal team with limited permissions be done within compliance?
Yes, it does rely on you giving them access to the compliance platform. So the way eDiscovery works in general is you've kind of got a starting assumption that no one's going to have access to every single piece of content across the entire organization. It doesn't work like that. No organization, unless you're sort of very on-prem, very centralized and possibly quite old-fashioned in your approach, no one's going to have access to absolutely everything. So yes, you can be very granular in what permissions you grant. There are specific eDiscovery reviewer roles. You would grant your legal team access to roles, give them access to the platform, and basically they would have access to complete that eDiscovery process.
Brilliant. Another one here is, what tool is best for subject access requests, kind of brackets GDPR?
Okay, so subject access requests, also subject rights requests, DSARs, I think there's at least 5 different names for them. Microsoft Priva gives you by far the slickest approach. So using those sort of pay-per-request subject rights request workflows will give you a really slick, efficient, end-to-end way of completing a subject rights request. So that's always going to be the preferable tool for doing that. eDiscovery does include a very basic subject rights request capability. All that's doing in eDiscovery is basically starting you off with a really basic query that looks for all content related to or authored by a particular person. So I would say at least give Priva a try, because it will make your life much easier.
Lovely. I've just got one last question here for us to answer, which is, would sensitivity labels still work if files are downloaded, i.e. outside of SharePoint?
Yes, and that's probably an important point that's worth clarifying. So things like lifecycle management, that's very much pinned to SharePoint, pinned to OneDrive, pinned to Exchange. It applies only within Microsoft 365. Sensitivity labels act at the file or the email level. So that label travels with the file or the email wherever it goes. So once you've labeled a file, doesn't matter whether you download the file, upload it to Google, copy it, rename it, it's still protected. If you ever used to password protect Excel spreadsheets and that kind of thing, sensitivity labels, encrypting files with sensitivity labels is really the modern way of doing that. It's doing exactly the same thing. It's encrypting the contents of the file so that unless you can prove your identity, doesn't matter where the file is, what it's called, where it's traveled, you're not going to be able to see the content.
Brilliant. That's all the questions that we've got. As I mentioned, we're going to be emailing a copy of the recording and slides to everyone either later today or tomorrow morning. So if you do have any questions that come up, please just reply to the email. Can happily get Jason's input and come back to you. But otherwise, Jason, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everyone.